Four teenage girls were closing up a frozen yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, laughing and making weekend plans as the city wound down for the evening. Hours later, the shop was engulfed in flames, and what firefighters uncovered inside would horrify an entire community. For more than 3 decades, the case remained one of Texas's darkest unsolved mysteries, marked by false confessions, ruined evidence, and restless ghosts that refused to be silenced, until a breakthrough in DNA technology finally revealed a name, proving that some crimes don't feed with time. They wait to be found. December 6, 1991, Austin, Texas. A Friday night. The air hung heavy with the sweetness of cinnamon, coffee, and frozen yogurt. It was the kind of night that fooled you, made you believe nothing bad could ever happen under the glow of Christmas lights. On a quiet strip near North Cross Mall stood a small shop with a cheerful name painted in bright, hopeful colors. I can't believe it's yogurt. Inside, the hum of freezers mixed with teenage laughter. 4 girls, all friends, some employees, some just hanging out. Jennifer Harbison, 17, confident, driven. Her younger sister, Sarah, 15, the quiet one, observant, gentle. Eliza Thomas, 17, the one with the warm, shy smile who could calm anyone. And Amy Ayers, 13, the youngest, just a kid really. She adored horses and dreamed of becoming a vet. 4 girls, 4 small universes of dreams and hope, gathered inside a place that smelled like vanilla and innocence. But that night, the sweetness would die, and Austin would never forget the taste. It was almost closing time. The girls were cleaning, chatting about weekend plans. Jennifer was in charge. She took her role seriously. She'd worked at the shop for a while, knew the closing routine by heart. Sarah was there to keep her company. Eliza was working too, quiet as ever, wiping down the counter with methodical precision. Amy, she was just hanging out, helping, because she didn't want to leave her friends alone that late. Outside, the streets were calm. The hum of traffic had thinned to a distant whisper. Somewhere nearby, Christmas lights blinked lazily on porches. The mall parking lot was half empty. A few customers came and went, a man buying yogurt for his kids, a couple holding hands. Then 2 young men entered. They didn't look out of place. No one remembers much about them except that one was tall and quiet, the other shorter, fidgeting with a baseball cap. They ordered, they smiled, and then they stayed. Close to midnight, Austin Police Officer Troy Gay was finishing his patrol when the call came in. Possible structure fire, 2949 West Anderson Lane. He was there in minutes. The small yogurt shop was already engulfed in flames. The air was thick with black smoke and the sharp hiss of burning plastic. Firefighters tore through the glass door, shouting orders through their oxygen masks. The interior glowed orange and red, like hell trapped inside a strip mall. They fought the fire for 20 minutes, maybe more. When it was finally safe to enter, the smoke cleared just enough for the first responders to see the unimaginable. 4 bodies, huddled together in the back room, naked bound, and burned. The silence was so heavy, some of the firefighters later said they could feel something watching them, like the room itself was holding its breath. One of them, Sergeant John Jones, later recalled, "I've seen murder scenes, but nothing like that. That place, it felt wrong. The air was heavy, like whatever happened there wasn't finished." The fire had been set deliberately. Accelerants were found. The cash register was open, some money missing. On paper, it looked like a robbery gone bad. But anyone who stepped into that scorched back room knew better. Each girl was bound with their own clothing. At least 3 showed signs of sexual assault. 2 had been shot, execution style. A .380 and a .22 caliber. 2 different guns. And all had been doused in lighter fluid before the fire consumed them. The autopsy reports later confirmed what the firefighters already suspected. This wasn't an impulsive crime. It was rage. It was control. It was evil. What the fire didn't destroy, it changed. Walls melted. Plastic dripped like wax. But in that transformation, something else took root. A kind of echo. Locals swore that for months after the fire, if you stood near the ruins late at night, you could still smell burnt sugar. A sickly, sweet scent that shouldn't have lingered, but did. Employees from neighboring stores reported hearing faint music, a girl's laughter, a cash register dinging long after the shop was gone. Some said they saw 4 shadowy figures standing inside the blackened space. They never moved, just stood there, together, and then gone. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, something of those girls stayed behind. Not in body, not in spirit maybe, but in presence. Like the shop itself remembered their fear. By sunrise, the "I can't believe it's yogurt" sign was half melted, drooping like a sad smile. The city woke to headlines that made no sense. 4 teenage girls murdered in a frozen yogurt shop. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teenagers who worked night shifts quit. The sense of safety in Austin, once warm and neighborly, evaporated overnight.
Detectives flooded the site, stepping carefully over melted floor tiles and charred shelves. Every scrap of evidence mattered. But the fire had done its job well. The crime scene was nearly obliterated. They collected what they could: bullet fragments, rope fibers, a single spent casing. And deep in the rubble, a trace of something else. A faint biological sample that, at the time, science couldn't yet decipher. A trace of the killer, hidden in fire. For weeks, Austin police worked around the clock. Hundreds of leads came in, none solid. Suspects were questioned, polygraphed, cleared. The public demanded answers. Then came the funerals. 4 caskets, 4 grieving families. The church overflowed with mourners, the air thick with incense and disbelief. Reporters whispered. Parents wept. And somewhere in the crowd, maybe unseen, maybe not of this world anymore, the 4 girls watched, unable to rest, because no one had spoken their killer's name. Years later, the building that replaced the yogurt shop changed hands again and again. No business lasted long. Customers said they felt uneasy, like being watched. A security guard once quit mid-shift, claiming he heard girls crying in the bathroom, but when he checked, it was empty. The city tried to move on. Austin was growing fast. tech companies, live music, optimism. But for those who remembered 1991, there was always a shadow under the streetlights near North Cross Mall, a memory of 4 girls who never came home, and a murderer or murderers who walked free. That night, the sweetness died, and with it, Austin's innocence. But the story didn't end in that back room, because the spirits of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, they weren't done speaking. And as decades passed, they would find ways, strange, subtle ways, to guide the living toward the truth. When the smoke cleared and the crime scene tape came down, what was left behind wasn't just ash and melted tiles. It was confusion, the kind that seeps into an investigation like oil into water. The Austin Police Department had never seen anything like this. A quadruple homicide of teenage girls, 2 different guns, fire as a cover-up, sexual assault, robbery, and no surviving witnesses. It was the kind of crime that doesn't just baffle a city, it breaks it. Every detective wanted the same thing – answers. Every parent wanted the same thing – safety. But what no one realized, at least not yet, was that the fire had burned away more than evidence. It had burned away the path to truth. And what would follow, for years, was a series of missteps, blind alleys, and one of the most painful examples of how desperation for justice can turn into injustice. The investigation in the early 90s was slow, grueling, and unsteady. They had fragments of bullets, a vague description of 2 men last seen inside the yogurt shop, and very little else. Witnesses described seeing 2 suspicious men in the parking lot that night, one with dark hair, the other possibly wearing a jacket with patches. But these leads fizzled out. Detectives chased hundreds of tips. None led anywhere solid. As the months turned into years, the case grew colder, heavier, more haunted. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, their life became a ritual of waiting. They watched press conferences, listened to promises from law enforcement, and clung to the idea that the killers would be caught any day now. But every year that passed without an arrest deepened the ache, and the community began to lose faith. Austin had changed by the late 1990s. It was bigger, busier, louder, but the mention of the yogurt shop murders could still silence a room. People spoke of it in lowered voices, as though even saying the words might disturb something sleeping beneath the city's surface. Then, almost 8 years after the murders, in 1999, everything suddenly shifted. 4 young men, Maurice Pierce, Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, and Forrest Welborn, were arrested and charged with the crime. It felt, for a moment, like a miracle. Reporters called it a breakthrough. Investigators claimed to have confessions. Families dared to exhale. But behind that relief was a darkness that no one saw coming. Maurice Pierce was the first to catch the police's attention. He had been stopped months earlier at North Cross Mall with a gun, a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber used in the yogurt shop murders. He was questioned, released, then later re-questioned after new detectives decided his story didn't add up. In time, he named 3 others, his friends Scott, Springsteen, and Welborn. The police followed the thread eagerly, convinced that they had cracked the code to Austin's most infamous mystery. Under hours of interrogation, the 4 young men, barely in their 20s, were grilled, pressured, cornered. Michael Scott, soft-spoken and impressionable, began to say what the detectives wanted to hear. Then Springsteen followed. They confessed, each shaping their words around what investigators hinted at, building a mosaic of half-truths and manufactured memory. But the confessions didn't match each other. They changed over time. The details contradicted physical evidence. Still, prosecutors clung to them. To the public, it looked like a resolution. Inside the interrogation rooms, it was something else: exhaustion, fear, and the slow unraveling of young minds. Scott's confession was the centerpiece of the case. He described being forced to rape one of the girls at gunpoint. He described lighting the fire. He described watching the others die. But when defense attorneys later obtained video recordings of those sessions, they revealed a disturbing pattern. Detectives feeding him details, correcting him when he got something wrong, pushing him toward the right answers. In one chilling moment, Scott hesitated before repeating a key detail, something about the order of the shootings, and the investigator leaned forward and said quietly, "You already know this, Mike. We've been over it." It was the kind of subtle coercion that breaks people. But in court, those tapes became a different kind of theater. The jury heard the confessions. They saw photographs from the crime scene. They saw the faces of 4 girls who would never grow older. And they convicted. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott received life in prison. The other 2, Pierce and Welburn, were eventually dropped from prosecution, but the damage had already been done. For the families, it was bittersweet closure. For Austin, it was relief. But for the spirits of the yogurt shop, they weren't done speaking, because the truth still hadn't been spoken.
There's a kind of weight that lingers in places where injustice has been done, even if that injustice hides behind the mask of justice. The yogurt shop was gone, rebuilt, painted over, but those who walked near it after the trials said the air felt wrong again. The new shop that moved in couldn't keep employees. They spoke of hearing faint whispers after closing, girls' voices overlapping, unintelligible but insistent. One worker leaving late one night said she smelled smoke, though nothing was burning. Another claimed to hear the sound of laughter that stopped abruptly the moment he turned the key in the door. Whether or not anyone believed those stories didn't matter. The feeling was real. The souls of the 4 girls, whatever you believe they had become, knew something the world didn't. They knew the wrong men were suffering. Years passed. Appeals began. Defense attorneys brought in new experts who argued the confessions were coerced. They pointed out that the physical evidence, the tiny traces of male DNA found at the scene, did not match any of the 4 men convicted. None. It was an enormous red flag. But by then, the system was too entangled in its own pride to admit it. It would take another decade before the truth finally began to surface. In 2009, after years of appeals, something extraordinary happened. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the convictions of both Scott and Springsteen. The reason was simple but devastating. Their confessions had been obtained under duress and could not be corroborated by physical evidence. Worse, the DNA from the crime scene, preserved miraculously through decades of fire damage and lab handling, pointed to someone else entirely, someone the state had never identified. The prosecutor's case fell apart. The men were released, but for nearly 10 years they had lived under the label of killer, haunted not by ghosts but by a system that had nearly destroyed them. Michael Scott later said he could still smell the yogurt shop's smoke when he closed his eyes, that he dreamed of the girls not as victims but as presences, watching him, almost forgiving, almost. It was as if the same spiritual residue that had clung to the ruins of the yogurt shop had followed the investigation, warping, guiding, confusing, protecting. Some detectives whispered that the case felt cursed. Files went missing, evidence logged under the wrong number, notes contradicted themselves. One investigator even claimed his digital recordings of an interview corrupted, replaced with white noise and static. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe something else at work, something unseen, pushing the wrong puzzle pieces apart so that the right ones could eventually fall into place. The families, torn between grief and renewed uncertainty, didn't know what to believe anymore. Some still thought the 4 young men had been involved.
Others couldn't accept that their daughter's killers were still out there. But those who'd spent the longest time near that case file, those who'd walked through that blackened shop in 1991, knew there was no peace in those convictions. The air still held its chill. The truth hadn't been burned away. It had only been buried, waiting for technology and time to dig it out. And so for another 15 years, the yogurt shop murders drifted in limbo. The files were boxed up, reopened, boxed again. Detectives were tired, new ones replaced them. Each generation tried to understand how something so cruel could happen in a place so ordinary. Some believed the fire had been the killer's last act of control, an attempt to erase himself from existence. But the spirits of the girls wouldn't let him vanish. They remained, whispering through every false lead, every wrongful accusation, every sleepless night of a detective who couldn't stop seeing their faces. When the men walked free, the families returned to the memorial site. It was quiet, just wind and a faint hum of traffic. Someone had left 4 small candles. Someone else had carved the initials of the girls into the wooden fence behind the lot. The families stood there in silence, unsure if justice had just been undone or if finally something had shifted back toward truth. What they didn't know was that deep in an evidence locker, sealed inside a sterile envelope, there was still a sample that refused to vanish. A microscopic trace of a man who had once walked into a yogurt shop on a cold December night and changed everything. A trace the fire couldn't destroy. A trace that science, one day, would finally learn to read. The wrong men were free. The case was cold again. But the story wasn't over. Somewhere in the stillness of Austin, 4 restless presences waited. Not for vengeance, for recognition, for their names to finally lead to the right one. And 30 years later, in a world with new tools and new eyes, that name would at last be spoken. Time has a strange way of dulling pain but sharpening mystery. Decades after the fire, Austin had become a different city. Busier, louder, richer. The skyline had changed, the neighborhoods grown, but beneath that polished surface, the wound of December 6, 1991 still bled quietly. The yogurt shop murders weren't just another unsolved case, they were a scar on the conscience of a city that prided itself on warmth and community. Every so often, a newspaper would run a story to mark another anniversary, and people would pause, remembering the girls' faces. Some younger residents didn't even know the details anymore, just whispers that a terrible thing had once happened near North Cross Mall, a story their parents never liked to tell.
In the police archives, the case file sat like a relic. 4 binders full of black and white photographs and burned evidence reports. There were the old cassette tapes of interviews, their labels curling with age. There were grainy crime scene prints showing melted counters, charred walls, and the outlines of what had once been lives. The evidence itself, bits of fabric, a bullet fragment, biological samples, was sealed and stored in climate-controlled rooms. No one knew if it would ever matter again. But then, something shifted. Science caught up. By the 2020s, forensic technology had evolved in ways that seemed almost supernatural. What had once been invisible could now be decoded. New DNA extraction techniques could pull genetic profiles out of evidence once thought useless, samples too damaged, too contaminated, or too degraded by fire. In 2024, a small cold case unit in Austin, staffed by a mix of veterans and new blood, reopened the yogurt shop file. They weren't looking for redemption, they were looking for truth. One of the detectives, a quiet, meticulous man named Lieutenant Hartley, had been a rookie in 1991. He remembered the fire. He remembered standing outside the smoldering building and promising himself he'd never forget those names. When the case landed back on his desk, 33 years later, it felt almost personal, like the girls had been waiting for him. They began by retesting everything: the ropes,
the clothing, the bullet casings. Modern labs use machines that could isolate genetic material at a level unimaginable in the 90s. Days turned to weeks as technicians combed through the old evidence. And then one night, the call came in. A partial male DNA profile had been recovered from a burned piece of evidence, likely from one of the victim's bindings. It was faint, fragmented, but viable. Hartley drove to the lab the next morning. He held the printed electropherogram like a sacred text. For the first time in over 3 decades, there was something tangible. A voice from the ash. They uploaded the genetic sequence into national databases, hoping for a match. There was none. Not in CODIS, not in state records. Whoever this man was, he'd never been arrested for a crime that required a DNA sample. But this was 2025 now, and there was another way. Genetic genealogy, the art of using public DNA databases to trace family trees from distant relatives, had already solved dozens of cold cases across the country. It had identified serial killers, rapists, and missing persons once thought lost to time. It was controversial, powerful, and in this case, it felt almost inevitable. The investigators partnered with a private lab in California, specializing in genealogical tracing. Scientists there began building family trees from the DNA fragment, connecting it to distant cousins, great-uncles, second cousins twice removed. Each name added another branch, and each branch narrowed the field. It was like watching fate being mapped in real time. Weeks passed. The family trees grew more defined, and slowly they converged on a single ancestral line, one that led to a man long dead. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers. The moment that name appeared, the air in the lab seemed to change. Brashers had been dead for over 20 years. He'd killed himself in 1999 after a police standoff in Missouri. His record was ugly: sexual assaults, armed robbery, suspected murders. A drifter who slipped through states, leaving chaos behind. When detectives compared his timeline with the yogurt shop murders, the pieces clicked together in a way that was almost too clean. He had been living in the region at the time, traveling under aliases, moving from job to job. He fit the profile. He fit the rage. Hartley stared at the screen. All those years of doubt, of false confessions, of empty theories. And now this. The DNA didn't lie. It had waited through decades of silence for science to catch up. They confirmed the match by direct comparison with Brasher's stored genetic material from earlier cases. The result came back conclusive. The male DNA recovered from the yogurt shop scene belonged to Robert Eugene Brashers. The news hit like a thunderclap. Forensic teams in Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas began cross-referencing Brasher's name with other unsolved crimes. What emerged was the portrait of a predator who had eluded capture through charm, mobility, and pure luck. He was linked by DNA to the murders of a mother and daughter in Missouri in 1998. He was suspected in a string of violent assaults stretching back to the 1980s. He was, in every sense, a ghost. Crossing state lines, reinventing himself, leaving nothing but pain behind. When the announcement went public in Austin, it felt both relieving and hollow. There would be no trial, no confession. Brashers had taken his own life years before. Families gathered again, older now, lined with time, and listened to police confirm what they had waited 34 years to hear: the killer's name. But even as they spoke it, something about the story felt unfinished. The detectives knew it. The families knew it. Because there had been 2 guns that night, a .30-80 and a .22, and Brasher's gun matched only 1. For Hartley, the breakthrough wasn't just science, it was spiritual. He couldn't shake the sense that something had been guiding the process, that each breakthrough, each lucky hit, had been pushed from somewhere unseen. He wasn't alone in that thought. Technicians had joked about lights flickering in the lab, about machines freezing and restarting themselves only when certain samples were loaded. One night when the lab was empty except for him, Hartley swore he heard a sound, a faint hum that rose into what could have been laughter. He wasn't frightened. He just whispered into the empty room, "We found him." Maybe it was imagination, or maybe it was acknowledgement. The discovery of Brasher's identity turned the case into a national headline again. Documentaries were greenlit. Podcasters called it a miracle of science. But for those closest to the case, it felt like a message from the dead. Proof that the girls had never been silent. In the months that followed, the investigation widened. Detectives looked into Brasher's known associates, searching for any sign of an accomplice. There were rumors he'd traveled with others, that he'd been seen in Austin with a partner, but every lead went cold. The second gun, the .22 caliber, remained an unanswered question, a whisper in the dark.
Still, for the first time in 34 years, there was clarity. The DNA that fire couldn't destroy had finally spoken. The dead man's name filled headlines, and for many, that was enough. The official statements called it closure, but the detectives who had seen the crime scene, the families who had lived in its shadow, and the few who still believed in things beyond the rational, all felt the same unease, that Brasher's hadn't worked alone, and that the spirits who had waited this long were not done. Sometimes, when Hartley stayed late in the office, he'd flip through the case photos. The faces of the 4 girls stared back at him, bright, hopeful, frozen in time. He'd set the pictures side by side on his desk, and the light from his computer screen would catch their eyes just so, making them glint as though alive. And he'd think about that night in December 1991, about the smell of sugar and smoke, about the way the fire had raged as if trying to keep a secret. It wasn't until the last file was closed for the night that he'd noticed the faintest trace of warmth in the air, a sensation that didn't belong in an office kept cold by the hum of air conditioning, almost like gratitude. 3 decades of silence had ended not because of luck, not because of brilliance, but because something in this world, or just beyond it, had refused to let go. The case that everyone thought was frozen in time had finally begun to breathe again. When the Austin Police Department announced the name, it was almost anticlimactic. A quiet press conference, a handful of journalists, a few shaking hands clutching old photographs, no flashing lights, no dramatic arrests, no courtroom showdown. Just a single, solemn declaration. The man responsible for the yogurt shop murders of 1991 was identified through advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. His name? Robert Eugene Brashers. The words hung in the air like a spell broken too late. For the families who had waited over 30 decades, there was a strange, quiet relief, but also confusion. Brashers had been dead since 1999. He couldn't face trial, couldn't speak, couldn't explain why. The justice that came was sterile and scientific, stripped of emotion, delivered by lab machines and genealogical databases, but it was justice. Of a kind. In the crowd, the families wept softly. Some held each other. Others stood stiffly, eyes blank, as though waiting for something more. Jennifer's mother later said it felt like hearing the end of a story she no longer recognized. "They said his name," she whispered, "but it didn't feel real, like the ghosts didn't believe it yet." Robert Eugene Brashers wasn't a stranger to violence. His life was a trail of chaos, moving state to state like a shadow slipping between cracks. Records showed a man who could be charming one moment and monstrous the next. Born in the mid-50s, raised in the rural South, Brashers drifted early: Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, back again. He joined the Army but didn't last long. People who knew him described him as charming, moody, always watching. He had a knack for disappearing, for reinventing himself. Every time the law came close, he moved,
leaving behind whispers and scars. By the time of the yogurt shop murders in 1991, Brashers had already been accused of violent crimes. In Florida, he was charged with assault and attempted rape, serving time before slipping away again. His rap sheet painted him as a drifter with an unpredictable temper and a disturbing fixation on control. He wasn't a mastermind, he was chaos wearing a human face. When the genealogical team traced the DNA and confirmed the match, they didn't just find the man, they found a pattern. The same DNA that tied him to the yogurt shop murders also matched two other unsolved killings: the brutal 1998 murders of a mother and daughter, Sherry and Megan Scherer, in Portageville, Missouri. Both had been shot and sexually assaulted. The similarities were undeniable. It was as if Brashers had left breadcrumbs across the American South, bits of horror tucked inside small towns, forgotten motels, empty highways. The man who killed in Austin continued killing long after the city's lights dimmed on that December night. Detectives revisiting his life found something else that chilled them: a familial connection to another murderer, a distant relative who had gone on a killing spree in Alabama in 1979. It was coincidence, maybe, or maybe something darker: a bloodline cursed, a lineage steeped in violence. Generations of rage passed like an infection. Brasher's crimes, when viewed as a whole, seemed less like random acts and more like echoes of something inherited. In 1999, years after the yogurt shop murders, police in Kennett, Missouri tracked Brashers down following a series of home invasions. Cornered in his car, he refused to surrender. He shot at officers, wounding one before turning the gun on himself. A .380 pistol, the same caliber as one of the weapons used in the yogurt shop murders. When investigators reopened his file in 2025, that detail became impossible to ignore. There was an eerie symmetry in it all: his suicide weapon matching the Austin bullets, his DNA haunting cold cases like fingerprints left by a ghost. For those who believed in the supernatural, it was too precise to be chance. The girls' spirits, they said, had waited until technology caught up. They had chosen the moment, guided the investigation, and made sure his name was finally spoken aloud. In the days after the announcement, strange things happened in Austin. News crews filming segments near the old site of the yogurt shop reported equipment failures, cameras shutting off, microphones dying mid-sentence. One cameraman claimed his lens fogged up despite the warm weather, and when he wiped it, there were faint smudges, like fingerprints that didn't match his own. Inside the police department, Detective Hartley couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brasher's face from an old mugshot: thin, sharp, expressionless. But sometimes behind that face, he thought he saw something else. The overlay of four smiling girls, translucent, almost protective. Not vengeance. Closure.
He started visiting the memorial site at night. He'd sit in his car with the engine off, staring at the plaque with their names. He'd whisper updates as if they could hear him. The breeze would stir, gentle, and he'd swear it carried the faintest scent of burned sugar. When the story hit the national press, journalists framed it as a triumph of science, but those close to the case didn't see it that way. They saw it as something fated, like the girls themselves had finally been able to push through the veil. For years, the case had been muddled with false confessions, wrongful convictions, and dead ends. But once the right technology existed, once the world could hear their truth, everything aligned. Hartley's partner, a skeptical younger detective, once asked him if he really believed the girls had somehow helped. Hartley just looked at him and said, "They waited for us to be ready." Even with Brashers named, though, the questions didn't stop. The biggest one: did he act alone? Two guns had been used that night, a .380, likely Brashers, and a .22. The ballistics suggested 2 shooters, not 1. Some theorized Brasher's carried both weapons, switching between them to confuse investigators. Others believed he had an accomplice, someone who'd never been caught, someone whose DNA was either destroyed by the fire or never left behind. Forensic experts combed through the evidence again, but nothing new surfaced. It was as if the second gunman, if there was one, had been erased, either by design or by the flames. Still, the unease persisted. The spirits might have named one of their killers, but one shadow still lingered. When the press conference ended, a few family members stayed behind. They didn't speak to the cameras. They just stood quietly, hands resting on each other's shoulders. One of them, Amy's older sister, later said she felt something lift from the air that day, like a long-held breath finally released. But as she drove home past the old shop location, she saw something that made her slow down. In the reflection of her car window, she swore she saw 4 figures standing near the lot, faint and flickering in the dark. They didn't move. They didn't fade right away. They just stood together, side by side, as they had been that night in 1991. She blinked, and they were gone. Closure doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just the end of one haunting and the beginning of another. That night, as rain began to fall across Austin, Detective Hartley sat at his desk reading Brasher's file for the 100th time. The pages smelled faintly of dust and something else, something sweet like vanilla. He smiled, exhausted, and whispered to the air. We said his name. The lights in the room flickered once, then steadied. He took that as acknowledgement. But as he turned off his lamp and left the file on the desk, the corner of one photo fluttered, as if brushed by a hand unseen. Beneath the still image of burned walls and melted yogurt machines, faintly, almost invisibly, the reflection of a second man seemed to shimmer through the blackened glass. Someone else had been there that night. Someone whose name hadn't yet been spoken. Robert E. Jean Brashers was not just a killer. He was a contagion that had passed through the cracks of America's underbelly, a man who carried violence the way others carried a heartbeat. But what chilled investigators most wasn't only what he did, it was how his life seemed woven into a dark tapestry of inherited destruction, as if he wasn't born into the world so much as released into it. After the DNA revelation in 2025, cold case researchers dove deep into Brasher's past, reconstructing the life of a man who'd spent most of it trying to erase himself. They found fragments scattered across states, decades, and aliases. Each piece added another dimension to the portrait of a man both ordinary and monstrous. He was born in the mid-1950s in a small town on the edge of the Mississippi River, a place that doesn't show up on most maps anymore. His childhood, by all accounts, was turbulent. His father was a mechanic, his mother quiet and devout. But there was a tension in that house that neighbors still remembered. Yelling, glass breaking, nights when the lights stayed off, even though the family was home. Brashers left early, joined the army, got in trouble for fighting, discharged, drifted through Florida, Arkansas, Alabama, Missouri, always staying just long enough to leave something broken behind. He had the kind of charm that drew people in before they realized the danger. He could make you laugh, fix your car, talk his way into a job, and then, out of nowhere, the switch would flip. He'd vanish overnight, and a week later, a woman would turn up beaten, raped, or dead. When police across multiple states started comparing notes after his identification, a disturbing pattern emerged. Brashers wasn't just connected to 1 or 2 cases. He was potentially tied to a chain of unsolved attacks stretching over a decade. Each bore his signature: control, humiliation, and fire. Always fire. It was as if he needed to cleanse his own crimes by destroying their evidence. But deep down, he might have known that fire only purifies the body. It never touches the soul. And then came another discovery. Buried in court archives from Alabama was a record from 1979, the case of a man named
Howard Brashers, Robert's cousin. Howard had gone on a violent rampage, murdering multiple victims in a spree that shocked the state. Different man, same blood, same rage. Investigators couldn't ignore the symmetry. 2 killers, same family tree, same inherited sickness. The forensic genealogists who had helped identify Robert were fascinated by this connection. They built out the Brashers family line and noticed something eerie, a pattern of deaths, arrests, suicides. It was as if violence had woven itself into the DNA, passed down like a curse. Science would call it coincidence. Faith might call it possession. The truth sat somewhere in the fog between.
In Missouri, the local sheriff who'd responded to Brasher's 1999 suicide described the scene like something out of a nightmare. Brasher's, cornered in his car after a shootout, had fired into his own head with his .380 pistol. When officers approached, they found several weapons, a notebook, and a photograph of a woman he'd been stalking. The gun, his suicide weapon, would later link, unofficially, to the bullets used in the Austin yogurt shop murders. It was the kind of connection that didn't need spiritual interpretation, it screamed it. The same weapon that had silenced 4 girls in Austin had silenced its wielder 8 years later. Poetic, almost biblical justice. But in the world of the yogurt shop case, nothing ever stayed neat for long. Even with Brasher's guilt confirmed through DNA, the second gun still cast a long shadow, the .22 caliber. Its shooter, whoever they were, had never been found. Some investigators theorized that Brasher's might have carried both guns, switching between them as an act of control or confusion. Others believed the second weapon belonged to a partner, someone who either helped him that night or watched as the fire devoured the evidence. One retired detective, a man named Castillo, believed firmly in the second theory. He had worked the case back in the 90s and never bought the lone wolf idea. That scene, he once said in an interview, it had 2 energies. You could feel it. One was dominant, angry. The other was colder, methodical. There's no way one man created both. Castillo's theory lined up with eyewitness reports from that night. 2 men seen inside the shop, one tall, one shorter. The taller one quiet, the shorter one nervous. Police had dismissed that detail after years of unreliable testimony, but now, decades later, it felt newly relevant. If Brasher's had been the tall one, who was the short? In the supernatural undercurrent of this story, that question wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Because in the years after Brasher's death, people who lived near his old haunts reported strange things. A house he once rented in Missouri was said to groan at night, like someone pacing upstairs. The family that moved in after him lasted 3 weeks before fleeing, claiming their child woke up screaming about a man in the hallway with black hands. And in Austin, near the site of the old yogurt shop, the hauntings returned. After the police named Brasher's, the area was supposed to find peace, but it didn't. The strange scents came back, burned sugar and smoke. People walking their dogs at night said they heard soft footsteps following them too light to be an adult's. 4 sets of steps, moving in sync. It was as if the girls were restless again, their unfinished story rattling the bones of the city. Maybe it was because Brasher's name was finally known, and in that naming they had stirred the second presence, the accomplice who'd remained in shadow. Detective Hartley felt it too. He began dreaming about the case again. In one dream, he was back inside the yogurt shop, but it wasn't burned. It was clean, bright, filled with laughter. He could see the girls behind the counter. Then the air changed, the lights flickered. A second man stepped out from the back room, a face Hartley couldn't see, just a silhouette. When he woke, he wrote in his notebook, "The other one is still out there." As investigators pieced together Brasher's life, it became clear that he thrived on control, but also on companionship. He often traveled with drifters, small-time criminals,
people who vanished just as easily as he did. One name kept popping up in old police logs: a man arrested with Brashers in Arkansas for an attempted car theft who disappeared after making bail. His name was redacted in several reports. No one ever found him again. Could that man have been in Austin in 1991? It's possible. Could he have held the .22? Also possible. But in a case defined by half answers, those questions hovered like smoke, visible but untouchable. Even the technology that had solved the case seemed to stall when it came to the second DNA. The labs tried retesting samples for another profile, but degradation was too severe. Whatever trace of the second gunman once existed was gone, devoured by fire and time. Still, the sense of presence persisted. Forensic technicians swore they felt watched when handling the yogurt shop evidence. Cameras glitched, lights flickered, data vanished from screens. Hartley began keeping a small recorder on his desk. Sometimes, late at night, when the station was empty, he'd hit record and just talk. To the girls, to the case, to whoever might be listening. Most nights, the playback was silent. But once, in the static, there was a voice, a whisper. It said one word: almost. He never told anyone. The trail of Robert Eugene Brashers didn't end with his death. It stretched backward and forward, looping through bloodlines and burned rooms, carrying the echo of something ancient and unrelenting. His name had finally been spoken, but the darkness he carried wasn't finished. It still clung to the unanswered questions, to the missing gun, to the second shadow that had stood beside him that night. And as 2025 turned into 2026, new investigators took the file again, armed with even newer tools. Hartley retired quietly that spring, but before he left, he wrote a single line on the inside of the case folder: "One spoke, one still hides." When the clerk later opened the file to log it, she swore she smelled something sweet, like melted vanilla. The revelation of Robert Eugene Brashers' name had given Austin something that looked like peace. Headlines called the yogurt shop murders finally solved. The police closed the press conferences with careful satisfaction, and the public nodded along, content to believe the monster had been found, even if he was long gone. But beneath the headlines and polite applause, the silence grew heavier, thicker, as if the air itself knew the truth was incomplete. There were still two guns. That fact refused to die, haunting the edges of every report, every conversation between detectives who couldn't let go. Two calibers, a .380, matching Brashers' weapon, and a .22, unaccounted for. No physical evidence tied anyone else to the scene. No surviving DNA, no footprints, just those bullets, cold, quiet, but undeniable.
For some, the explanation was simple. Maybe Brashers carried both guns. Maybe he'd brought the smaller one as backup. Maybe he'd even forced one of the girls to fire it to confuse investigators. Theories spun out like smoke rings, momentarily visible, then gone. But to the people who'd touched that case, to those who'd walked through the ashes, the logic never felt right. Detective Hartley couldn't stop thinking about the second weapon. Even after he retired, the question gnawed at him. Late at night, he'd pull the old case notes out of a box in his garage and reread them, hoping to find something everyone had missed. It was as though the .22 had left a psychic fingerprint, a phantom presence woven into every page. He wasn't alone. Across Austin, strange things began happening again. A security guard patrolling the strip mall one night claimed he heard laughter inside a vacant storefront, the same space where the yogurt shop had once stood. It was faint, distant, like a memory playing on a loop. When he called out, it stopped instantly. Then, from somewhere deeper in the dark, came the metallic click of a hammer being pulled back.
He quit the next day. A woman who lived nearby said she started dreaming about fire, not seeing it, but smelling it. In the dreams, she stood outside a building she didn't recognize, and somewhere inside, someone was crying. The next morning, she drove past the North Cross lot and realized the building in her dreams had been real, the yogurt shop. People began to talk again, the way small towns do when something buried starts to stir. The case that was supposed to be closed suddenly felt alive, as though it refused to rest. And every whisper, every flicker of strangeness circled back to the same idea. There had been someone else. Hartley, despite himself, started keeping a journal. He filled it with small details, times when the temperature in his house dropped suddenly, or when his radio cut out mid-song, leaving a burst of static that sounded almost like a voice. He never wrote the word haunted, but he didn't need to. The implications soaked through every page. He'd wake up at 3:15 a.m. to find the hallway light flickering. Once his dog growled at the empty corner of the room, the hair along its spine bristling. And then there was the night he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving down his hallway. He grabbed his gun, called out. No answer. But in the silence that followed, he heard it. A faint female voice whispering his name. Not threatening, almost pleading. He told no one. Meanwhile, the Austin Police Department's Cold Case Division had reclassified the yogurt shop investigation as active with supplemental inquiry. It wasn't just a formality. New techniques in partial DNA recovery had emerged. Scientists believe that with micro-reconstruction, even heat-damaged samples might yield trace genetic signatures. The idea thrilled Hartley and terrified him in equal measure. The new team, led by Detective Karina Lopez, began re-examining every fragment from the crime scene. Cloth fibers, floor debris, melted plastic, even air filters from the HVAC system preserved in storage. It was a long shot, so was everything in this case. And then, something happened that no one could explain. During one late-night lab session, a technician working on one of the burned samples heard a sound in his headphones, a faint hum, like an electrical interference. But it wasn't static. It had rhythm, like breathing. When he checked the recording later, the hum rose into what could only be described as whispering, faint, distorted, but human. He replayed it several times before he realized what the voice was saying. Find him. The audio log was reviewed, cleaned, analyzed. No interference, no external signals, no explainable source. It shouldn't have been there, but it was. Detective Lopez wasn't the kind to entertain ghosts, but even she felt something strange when she touched the evidence bag holding the bullet fragments. A pulse, maybe, or a tremor that ran through her fingers. She shook it off. Old wiring, she told herself. I'm tired. But when she turned around, she swore she saw movement in the reflection of the lab's observation window. 4 faint figures standing side by side, watching. That same week, new ballistic analysis revealed that the 22 bullets had been fired from a weapon consistent with an older model, possibly a Ruger Mark II pistol. Detectives found no record of Brasher's ever owning one. His known weapon was the .380. So where had the second gun come from? The files from the early investigation hinted at an unknown accomplice. A few witnesses had described a second man in the shop that night, shorter, younger, nervous. The composite sketch was crude, half-smudged. He'd never been identified. Some thought he was a figment of trauma, the product of chaotic memories. Others believed he was real, and that he'd escaped into the fire's confusion. Hartley began visiting the North Cross site again, parking across the street and sitting in silence.
Sometimes the air around him would cool suddenly, even in the Texas heat. Sometimes he'd feel pressure in his chest, like the moment before lightning strikes. He didn't speak out loud anymore. He just waited.
One night, something finally answered. As he sat in the dark, headlights flickering from passing cars, he felt the familiar chill creep through the air. The sound came next, a single gunshot, distant but sharp, like an echo from decades ago. He jerked upright, scanning the street. Nothing. The night was still. Then, faintly, a whisper brushed past his ear. "He's not gone." Hartley froze. The voice was female, soft, sad. He looked toward the old storefront, now empty again after yet another business had failed. For a moment, in the reflection of his car window, he thought he saw 4 figures inside. Then the image wavered, and behind them, something darker. A 5th silhouette, small, indistinct, moving in the background like smoke. The lights from the building flickered once, though no electricity ran to it. Then everything went still again. That night, Hartley didn't sleep. He wrote only one line in his journal. "The second gun still speaks." Meanwhile, in the lab, Lopez and her team discovered something new. A partial fingerprint on the inside of a melted yogurt cup lid. It had survived somehow, trapped beneath a layer of soot. Too damaged for identification in the past, but modern enhancement software could rebuild partial ridge patterns. It wasn't enough to name anyone, but it was enough to prove that another hand had touched that lid. Someone who wasn't Brasher's, wasn't a victim, and wasn't a first responder. The ghost of the .22 had left a mark after all. Lopez didn't tell the press. She knew better than to feed another frenzy. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led towards something, by science or fate or the restless insistence of 4 teenage girls who refused to be silenced by time. The new results were logged, sealed, and scheduled for further analysis. As Lopez closed the file, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered twice, as if blinking. The air smelled faintly, impossibly, of burned sugar. She whispered to herself, "We're not done yet." And somewhere, in the empty corridors of the Austin Police Department, the faint echo of a second gunshot rang again, soft, distant, almost polite. A reminder. Because justice once summoned doesn't always stop when the case file says solved. Sometimes it keeps walking beside the living, whispering through static and dreams, waiting for the second name to be spoken. By the time the calendar turned to late 2025, the yogurt shop murders had become something bigger than a case file. They had crossed that invisible line between history and haunting, where the facts were solid, but the air around them shimmered with things no report could capture. The fire had taken 4 young lives, but it had also left behind something the flames couldn't touch: presence. Even now, when you stood near the old North Cross lot, you could feel it. The land hummed with static. The air, thick and metallic, seemed to remember the sound of screaming, the crack of 2 guns, the muffled rush of fire. People avoided that block after dark, though no one admitted why. Drivers reported their headlights dimming for just a moment as they passed. Cell phones lost signal. Dogs refused to walk across the sidewalk in front of the building. To most, it was just urban legend, the ghosts of 4 girls who never got justice. But to those who knew the case, to those who had spent years chasing the truth through dead ends and dark corners, the haunt was real. It was an energy that followed you home. Detective Karina Lopez learned that the hard way. After she took over the reopened investigation, her nights changed. It began small, a strange hum in her apartment, her laptop turning on by itself.
the faint smell of melted sugar drifting through her living room. Then came the dreams. Every night, she found herself back in the shop. Everything was clean again, untouched by fire. The walls were bright, the freezers humming softly. The girls were there too. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy, laughing, wiping down tables, oblivious. But every time Lopez tried to speak, to warn them, something would shift. The laughter would stop. The lights would flicker. Then she'd see him, a tall man with cold eyes standing in the doorway, Brasher's, always watching. But behind him, just out of sight, was something else. Someone smaller, quicker. The second shadow. Lopez would wake up gasping every time, her bedsheets tangled, her heart racing. She told no one. Meanwhile, the lab reports on the partial fingerprint came back inconclusive. The ridges were incomplete, the data fractured. They couldn't prove who it belonged to, but they could confirm what it wasn't. It wasn't Brasher's, it wasn't any of the victims, and it wasn't a first responder. The ghost of the .22 had left a mark after all.
The news hit Lopez like a slow chill. She stared at the report for a long time, thinking about the second gun, about the whispers in the lab recording. Find him. She brought it to Hartley. Though retired, he still checked in now and then, unable to fully detach from the case that had haunted him for most of his life. When he read the report, he didn't speak for several minutes. Finally, he looked up and said, "He's still out there." Lopez frowned. He'd be in his 60s, maybe 70s by now, if he's alive at all. Hartley just shook his head. "I don't think alive is the right word anymore." That night, he went home and poured himself a drink, something he rarely did. The memories came fast, the heat from the fire, the sight of the bodies, the look in Amy Ayer's eyes even after death. He'd carried that image for 30 years. He'd thought it would fade. It never did. He went to bed around midnight, leaving his living room light on. At 3:15 a.m., he woke to the sound of footsteps again. This time, he didn't reach for his gun. He sat up slowly, listening. The steps stopped right outside his bedroom door. Then, in a voice soft and broken, a girl whispered, "We found him." The door creaked open. Hartley didn't see anything. No one standing there, no shadow moving in the hall. But the air smelled faintly of burned sugar and smoke. Across town, Lopez was wide awake too. She couldn't stop thinking about the fingerprint, the whisper, the shadow in her dreams. She went back to the station in the middle of the night, logged into the evidence database, and began cross-referencing every old suspect, every witness, every transient questioned in the original investigation. At 4:02 a.m., she found a name. It was buried in a supplemental report from 1992. A drifter questioned near the mall 2 days after the fire. He'd matched one of the witness descriptions, short, nervous, with a habit of biting his nails until they bled. He'd claimed he was just passing through, heading to Arkansas. Police at the time cleared him quickly. No reason to hold him, no physical evidence connecting him to the scene. His name was Dale Varnell. Lopez stared at the name for a long time. She ran it through the system. Nothing. No current address, no death certificate, no criminal record after 1993. It was like he'd disappeared completely. When she showed the name to Hartley the next day, his hands trembled. He said, "That's it. That's the other one. I remember his interview. He couldn't stop twitching. Said he'd never been in the shop, but his shoes were wet. It hadn't rained for days." Lopez dug deeper, tracing Varnell's past. He'd grown up in Missouri, the same part of the state Brasher's came from. His last known job had been in a mechanic shop not far from where Brasher's once worked. There were overlaps everywhere, too many to be coincidence.
When Lopez reached out to local police, she got one more shock. Varnell had died in 2002. Car crash. No autopsy. Buried in an unmarked grave outside Cape Girardeau. But death didn't always mean gone. That week, Lopez's team ran one last test on the fingerprint using new AI reconstruction. The system built a partial digital image, enough to compare against database prints. It wasn't perfect, but it produced one chilling hit. Dale Varnell. The match probability was only 63%, far from conclusive, but to Lopez and Hartley, it felt final. The second gun had a name. The official report would never state it as a fact. There wasn't enough evidence for an indictment, no chance of trial. But among those who had carried the case for decades, it became an accepted truth. Robert Eugene Brashears hadn't been alone that night. Dale Varnell had stood beside him in the back room of the yogurt shop, holding the smaller gun, helping carry out the horror. Somewhere between the flames and the smoke, their fates had split. Brashears had died by his own hand. Varnell had drifted into obscurity, dying quietly, never facing the fire he helped ignite. And yet, the story didn't end there. A week after the fingerprint revelation, Lopez visited the old lot again. It was just an empty storefront now, the windows covered in dust. She stood there for a long time, listening. The city noise faded, replaced by a strange quiet, like the air before a storm. Then, faintly, she heard laughter. Not cruel or mocking, soft, like teenage girls telling secrets. She smiled through tears. "It's over," she whispered. A gust of wind swept past her, carrying that same smell of burned sugar. When she turned to leave, she saw movement in the glass door's reflection. 4 figures standing together, holding hands. Behind them, in the dim light, 2 shadows lingered. One tall, one smaller, both fading. And then, just like that, they were gone. The city of Austin finally exhaled. The files were sealed. The case, officially, was closed. But for those who had lived inside its darkness, the detectives, the families, even the ghosts, the truth felt heavier than justice. Because justice ends, the haunting doesn't.
Every December, around the anniversary, people still leave candles outside that empty storefront. 4 candles for 4 girls. Sometimes, late at night, a 5th one appears, unlit, sitting quietly beside the rest. No one ever sees who leaves it there. And every year, the wind carries the faintest trace of sweetness and smoke, like the city remembering, like the spirits themselves keeping vigil. Because the sweetness that died that night in 1991 was never just about yogurt or innocence. It was about the illusion that evil could ever truly burn away. Some things stay, some whispers never fade, and in the dark corners of Austin's memory, the yogurt shop still hums, its ghosts watching, patient, eternal. By the time 3.5 decades had passed since that December night in 1991, the yogurt shop murders had become part of Austin's folklore. The city changed around the memory, new buildings rising where the old strip mall once stood, new people walking the same pavement with no idea what had happened there. Yet the ground itself remembered. Asphalt poured over ash, concrete over bone, the memory of 4 girls resting just below the hum of tires and footsteps. Every few years, the story would drift back into the news, a new documentary, a podcast, an anniversary special. The same photographs, 4 young faces smiling out from another lifetime, were printed again and again. For most viewers, they were names from history. For those who had lived through it, they were a weight that never left. Detective Hartley lived out his retirement in a small house on the edge of the city. The box of case files never left his study. Sometimes he'd open it and sit quietly, rereading the old reports until the words blurred together. He didn't need to look at the photos anymore. They were etched behind his eyes. When the identification of Brashers had come, it had been both an ending and a reminder. He'd thought knowing the killer's name would let the voices rest, but the silence that followed was louder than before. He took to visiting the memorial each December. 4 candles, sometimes 5. The city had made the place official now. A simple plaque, names carved cleanly in brass. Some nights he'd find flowers, other nights notes folded into the cracks of the pavement. He never read them. He didn't need to. On the 35th anniversary, a small crowd gathered for a vigil. There were news cameras again, their lights cutting through the dusk. The mayor spoke, then the families. Hartley stood in the back, unseen, listening to the names being read. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy, each name like the tolling of a distant bell. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to drift away, he stayed behind. The air had that same strange chill it always did here, cooler than the rest of the city, heavy with something unsaid. He looked at the candles flickering in the wind, then at the faint reflection of himself in the glass of the darkened storefront. For a moment, he thought he saw them there again, 4 faint shapes standing shoulder to shoulder, light playing where no light should reach. He whispered, "We found him. We found both of them." The reflection seemed to move, as if nodding. Then it was gone. Across town, Detective Lopez kept the case file on her desk, even though it was officially closed. The partial fingerprint, the whisper caught on tape, the dreams, none of it could be explained in any report, but she felt the pull of it still. Sometimes she'd stay late in the office, scrolling through cold case databases, following tiny leads that led nowhere. She told herself she was just being thorough, but deep down she knew it was something else. The dead had a way of asking for attention. One night, long after the rest of the department had gone home, she heard the faint click of a keyboard from the next room. She called out, thinking a colleague had come back. No answer. She stepped into the hall and saw the glow of her own monitor still on. The cursor blinked in an open document she hadn't created. One line of text sat in the middle of the screen. "Thank you." She stared at it for a long time, her pulse thudding in her ears. Then, without touching anything, she whispered, "You're welcome." The cursor stopped blinking. The screen went dark. No one at the department ever spoke of hauntings, but everyone who worked that case carried something invisible away from it. A static in the ears, a scent of burned sugar that appeared at odd moments, a sudden drop in temperature during quiet nights. Small reminders that some stories refuse to end. The city, of course, moved on. Austin's skyline stretched taller, its music louder. People passed the memorial without slowing down, but every December, someone lit the candles again, 4 flames that never seemed to go out, no matter the wind. And sometimes, if you happened to walk by in that season's deep silence, you might hear something faint beneath the traffic. A hum, a laugh, the echo of young voices busy closing a shop they would never leave. The yogurt shop murders became a cautionary tale, a crime solved by science, but sealed by mystery. Forensic genealogy had given the victims their killer's name, yet left behind the question that no lab could answer. Why do some evils linger? Why do they echo long after the fire dies? No one could explain the strange patterns in the case, the evidence that refused to burn, the confessions that collapsed, the way technology arrived just in time. Logic said coincidence. Faith said something else.
In the end, all that remained was the sense that four spirits, patient and unwavering, had waited until the world was finally ready to hear them. They had spoken through data, through whispers, through dreams, until their truth surfaced. Now, when the city sleeps and the wind drifts down Anderson Lane, a faint sweetness rides the air. It isn't the scent of yogurt or sugar, but memory, the trace of something once innocent, now eternal. The shop is gone, the killers are gone, the investigators are old, but the story still breathes. Somewhere in the quiet, the laughter of four girls lingers, soft as candlelight, reminding the living that even in a world of evidence and science, some part of justice belongs to the unseen. And so the sweetness that died in 1991 remains, reshaped into something gentler, quieter, but unforgotten. A promise carried on the wind that the dead, when they choose, will always find a way to speak.